my pleasure to introduce John Kristoff presenting the 2022 H1 DDoS Threat Landscape Report. John is a principal analyst at NETSCOUT and a PhD at UIC. John first spoke at NANOG in 2004, and today marks his 19th presentation at NANOG. John is also a valued member of the NANOG Program Committee. Welcome back to the stage, John. We're happy to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, good afternoon. So for those of you who don't know who I am, you can probably learn as much as you care to by searching around the net, but briefly, my role at NETSCOUT is, as it says here in the title, is a principal analyst. But what that means is I work with our data that we get from contributions from customers. So before I get started, what you're about to see, I want to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of how we do what we do and produce some of the plots and some of the data that we get. So NETSCOUT is it's an organization that does lots of network-oriented things, but our particular group is mainly involved in DDoS mitigation and protection. So some of you are probably familiar with old Arbor Networks, the PeakFlow product, and now it's known as Sightline. That's essentially the group that I'm in. We look at the data that we get from customers who contribute DDoS attack alerts back to us. So we get not exactly like a NetFlow record, but we get something that's derived from, in part, NetFlow. We get summaries of attacks that describe source networks, destination networks, protocols, prefixes, and something that those sorts of bits of information like packets per second and so forth that you might find in the NetFlow record. But I don't get to see NetFlow records. So all I get to see is a summary of an attack alert. An attack alert has to be of medium, or we classify as medium and higher threshold. This is data that comes back to us internally, only for our group to produce reports like this and do blog posts, and actually to look for and monitor and analyze trends, and to help inform our product teams and to figure out how to actually do DDoS mitigation in some ways better. So that's what we do. This data doesn't go anywhere else. It's not sold to anybody. It doesn't leave NETSCOUT. So our data isn't necessarily perfect. Our data is really just a view of what we see and what we can reasonably make, put a stake in the ground towards. So like, for instance, to give you an idea, to give you sort of that stake in the ground, here's some numbers that we could say with reasonably good confidence of what we have observed in the first half of this year. So, some number of attack counts. So what's an attack? It's simply something that our systems detect as exceeding some threshold, those medium or higher level thresholds. Usually it's volumetric, but it could be some other means of some defined thresholds in the product or the customer sets. So 6 million, that's roughly about what we've seen over the last year or so. So there's not much change here. So these numbers are somewhat, to me, not quite as interesting as some of the plots that I'll show you. But if you care about numbers, some people care about internet speed LAN records, who's had the biggest DDoS attack this year. Some people care about that stuff. I don't so much. Sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes the reports of those are even accurate. Oftentimes they're not. Sometimes we confirm some of the reports that we see others making claims about. Sometimes we might kind of snicker and say, yeah, it probably wasn't actually that big. That's not really all that important. The other thing to note is what we see is really, because it's based more or less on NetFlow, our attack vectors is really based on what you might find in the NetFlow and how you might do detection based on traffic flow that's flowing through routers. So you can see the top vectors that we identify, this TCP ACK and SYN and amplification. We can't tell you anything about the payload because we just don't see that. So the vectors are not necessarily congruent to what you might think of as a traditional sort of malware attack, a specific type of Mirai variant or that sort of thing. So that's all I kind of wanted to note here to kind of give you an overview of what we're able to see and how we actually report it. So imperfectly or not, we break down our view of the world into 4 major geographic regions. And this is very imperfect, and it's probably unfair to some countries. And it's not really necessarily a perfect picture of the world because it all sort of gets clustered together, and the aggregate of everything that's happening, even into 4 major groups, you really can't always tell a whole lot of what's happening. But for instance, here you can see these are attack counts grouped by what we classify as our regions. So the top region in red is this Europe, Middle Eastern, and Africa region. That's a pretty wide and diverse region, right? That spans essentially from the top of the northern hemisphere down to the southern hemisphere, all sorts of cultures and religions and economies, populations. Then there's the Asia-Pacific region, which more or less includes countries like from India over across to China, Philippines, down towards Australia, New Zealand. North America, that's predominantly made up of, at least in bulk of the DDoS attacks we see, is the US. There's notable mention for Canada in there and a couple other countries that got classified in that group, but it's largely dominated by the US. And then Latin America, which includes all the countries essentially south of the US, from Mexico on down to the tip of South America, and also including the Caribbean. So looking at this graph, there's not a whole lot that necessarily really stands out. You might see a couple peaks or valleys and something that might look like a trend, but it's actually hard to make some things out here, I think. You might notice, perhaps, that the top red line graph here, the Europe, Middle Eastern, Africa region, there does appear to have been something that happened around March, and you can probably guess what that pertains to. We'll look a little bit more at that a little closely in a moment. So I'm going to kind of go through some of this quickly for sake of time, but when we look at classifying what we see in terms of the types of attacks, one noticeable trend that's been happening over the past year is the increasing frequency more and more of what we call direct path attacks. This is largely due to the malware that's taking advantage of IoT devices, like the variants like from Mirai, where the attacks aren't spoofed. They're direct paths. And so we still see significant volumes of spoofed DNS and NTP and other types of UDP-based amplification. The direct path stuff is really becoming more and more predominant these days. Perhaps that's a trend that'll continue. It's unclear. Keep doing the BCP38 stuff and the anti-spoofing bits, because that does help. We see positive impact when people do that, but the direct path stuff is increasing. Industries are probably not too much unlike what you might expect. The folks in this room, the providers, the carriers, the telecommunication organizations, the hosting providers, take on more or less the bulk of the attacks. And this is really classified with the enrichment tools that we use. So it's somewhat imperfect, perhaps. If we were to kind of chop off the first 4 or 5 bars of these, things get a little bit more interesting when we dig onto other types of industries. We can see some interesting trends that happen in banking or satellite communications and whatnot. But still, you all in this room are largely, at least from the perspective of being on the receiving end, the destination of attacks, still receive the bulk of them. The duration of attacks tend to be very short. The picture is more or less the same across all the 4 regions that I've shown here. There are little slight differences, but usually most attacks don't last more than about 15 or so minutes. We do see some that last for days, but those tend to be the outliers than the norm. Most attacks are actually quite short. So we group in the 4 regions. This is just a rough summary of what the regions look like from our perspective. This is APAC. Here's a grouping of some of the countries in that group that we thought we would highlight. For instance, you see this very specific standout spike here in the middle, this blue line, for those of you that can make that out. This actually correlates to an endorsement by the Taiwanese government of Ukraine in March. When that endorsement was made, that public pronouncement in support of Ukraine, we noticed just briefly a number of attacks increased towards the Taiwanese region. There may be some other patterns in here, but I'll just point out that one for here, and I'm going to do the same for some of the other countries as we go. The targeted industries, somewhat interesting. I'm going to kind of skip over this. You can look at this later if you care to in the slide deck. Here's the one that I think maybe most of us might be interested this time around, the European, Middle East, and Africa region. Particularly, there's a group of countries that were involved in this conflict, in this war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. The bright red line in this graph is Russia. And you can see that the number of attacks that we observed towards Russia increased dramatically, about 2 or 3 times, beginning around the start of March. And that's maybe not so surprising. Maybe you would expect that. What's maybe a little bit less, or a little bit more surprising, is Ukraine. The Ukraine in this graph is in the yellow line and kind of towards the bottom. And things are kind of more or less stable up until March. Then you notice a precipitous drop and kind of stays down in this lower region under 200 attacks per day. Now you might try to venture a guess as why was there such a dramatic rise in attacks against Russia, and why was there this drop in Ukraine? Some of you, perhaps you think, maybe by show of hands, infrastructure may be destroyed in Ukraine. Who thinks maybe that was a contributing factor? A couple of people think that, right? It seems reasonable. Perhaps it was attackers chose sides. And some people thought, I'm going to, like much of the world sided with Ukraine on this, and so Russia is the bad guys, and so we're going to attack Russia. And so maybe Russia just received the bulk of attacks because Ukraine enjoyed the world's sympathies. So maybe you feel that was the reason for this. What we believe is responsible for part of this, at least, if not a significant amount of that shift, for Ukraine in particular, is that it wasn't necessarily that the Ukraine infrastructure was destroyed, but the Ukraine systems and the services that were physically located and geolocated, according to our enrichment data, moved out of Ukraine, left, went somewhere else. And so the attacks didn't necessarily stop against what were Ukraine targets, but they just don't look like they were targeting Ukraine, specifically the geographic country of Ukraine. So we highlight in here too, you'll see some other countries here like Finland and Ireland in some places. Some of these other countries will receive additional attacks. Ireland, for example, is a curious example. You might think about why that might be, and I'll tell you in a little bit. If you think you might know, I'll maybe call on you. So Finland received some attacks largely because their endorsement also of NATO, wanting to enter into NATO, and sympathies again aligned with Russia, decided to attack Finland. So you see lots of this sort of bleed over effect based on the politicalization of these issues. This is actually mislabeled as APAC, that should be EMA. Latin America, reasonably sized, about the same size as some of these other regions in terms of ASNs and countries. A little bit different perspective in terms of traffic. Brazil here dominates, as you might guess. You see Colombia also plays a significant role here. And in fact, there was an event where there was an election where we see some attacks that increased in Colombia here in the early part of the year when there was when the election was rampant. Some more top industry stuff. Maybe the one thing to note here in Latin America where we really see the distinction, the green bars indicate the most latest data from 2022. And you can see that the precipitous drop here from 2021 in the hosting providers, the wireline providers, the telecommunication providers. Other things have increased, of course, but noticeably those industry sectors have decreased. In North America, this is what the picture looks like. As you can see, the US really dominates this graph here from our perspective. Depending on how you count, I don't know even the two countries that we include in North America. You can count up to 20 or 30 countries as part of North America, but no matter how you count, the US really does dominate this graph. Here's the industries for North America. Here's another picture of Russia-Ukraine that I thought you might find interesting. Now this is over a little bit longer time scale, so it goes back to 2021. But over towards the right, you see that large, now it's in light blue, Russia, the attack traffic has increased significantly. The yellow again is Ukraine, it drops. But you'll also see here Finland and Ireland. Ireland, probably appropriately, is in green. That is almost perfectly correlated with the Ukraine drop. Now the Ireland increase, we believe, is in large part because of the infrastructure, or some of the infrastructure that was moved from Ukraine to the so-called cloud, some of that cloud being in Ireland. So that's why you see some of that shift there at that moment in time going from Ukraine to Ireland. Here's another view of the ripple effect. showing a point in time of when the invasion occurred, and the countries under perspective here, the top one being Finland. Again, Finland showing support for NATO, wanted to join NATO. On the bottom, here's Ireland. It's a little bit less pronounced, but here again, you do see the shift in traffic that was from Ukraine that moved over into Ireland, most likely because of the effects of cloud infrastructure where things were starting to be deployed. And that's largely continued throughout this time period. Another graph showing some cause and ripple effects. KillNet is a thing if you want to look up what KillNet is. KillNet is a group purportedly made up of Russian hackers that declare DDoS attacks against different entities, and they make threats, and then we can see if there's actually some correlated attack events when these threats are made. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. But you can see a few countries here that are involved, and sometimes the threats amount to almost nothing. Other times they're a little bit more interesting. One thing that we were kind of looking for, I think it's probably a little bit hard to actually pull this out though, because the data is somewhat imperfect. How satellite communication networks get classified is a little bit tricky, I think, yet still, because there's probably a lot of NAT going on. But we did see a little bit of a rise in attacks against satellite communications. And you can probably guess why this is, the increased deployment of satellite communications in Europe in particular. We're seeing a little bit of a rise there, so we're going to be kind of watching this over time to see what the effect of this is. Now there's a whole bunch more that I could show you that I just don't have time to show you. If you want to go take a look, there's nothing to sign up for. You just go to this link. You can go check out a whole bunch of other stuff, including more attack vector stuff, specific botnets, families, all that kind of good stuff. There's more text, so you can read about some of this if you care to. If not, if that's not good enough for you, if you have specific questions we don't have time for today, you can certainly contact me. There's my email address here on the slide, and I think I've left probably 3 or 4 or 5 minutes for questions. If there are any, I'm happy to entertain them. Thanks very much for your time and attention. Yes, sir.
Hey, John. Thanks for the talk. Mike Star Tract. Question around, like you mentioned the timing of DDoS attacks. Is there any correlation between who or where the attacks are coming from and their motivation? So ideological, political, monetary. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your question. So all the graphs that I showed are largely based around the destination of the attacks, right? It's actually much easier for us to do that because it's very easy to tell where things are going as opposed to where they come from, obviously because they may be spoofed, right? So we didn't actually invest a whole lot of effort into seeing where things were coming from necessarily for 2 reasons. One, because of the spoofing effect, because we can't always be sure. And 2, because it's often from a lot of different places. So there's not necessarily one predominant place where attacks are coming from. It's not necessarily that we can't pinpoint specific hosting providers or networks that are responsible for a lot of addresses that are responsible for spoofing, or hosting providers that have a lot of IoT devices, that sort of thing. We're not necessarily always that interested either in calling them out publicly and shaming them. We're a little bit careful to not necessarily blame them because it may or may not be appropriate to do so. But we can see some of that, but that hasn't really been our focus recently. It's interesting to look at, but maybe that's a separate discussion. The financial motivation is always there. One of the suggestions I had for a group was that early on, before we were looking at this graph, is why we weren't seeing many attacks against Ukraine as we thought we might when the war took place. I thought maybe it's because there was no financial incentive for anyone to do that. A lot of the attackers, especially of Russian origin, are very financially motivated. And if they weren't being financially incentivized to attack Ukraine, maybe that just wasn't happening for that reason. I don't know if that's true or not. I assume it could be true, but I didn't look into that any further than just sort of guessing. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks very much again.
Nothing online.
What? Nothing online?
No, nothing online.